to week 4, the Baroque period. This period in time is from 1600 to 1750. During this first week, we're going to be answering questions like, what is the Baroque period? What does the word even mean? What does the music of the period sound like, especially the instrumental music? Next week is when we will talk about the Baroque vocal styles. Who wrote this music and why did they write it? And does this music still matter today? To answer these questions, we have to ask another question. What came before the Baroque period? The answer is the Renaissance. It was a period in history right before the Baroque era that emphasized humanism, realism, and classicism. Humanism was basically the idea that it was all right to be human, it was a good thing, and that the human mind, the soul, and the human body were all things that could be studied and that could be understood better. Before this, the church had had such power over everyone that the human form had simply been considered sinful and that the human mind had been considered sinful. So now people were starting to look at the human as an intelligent being that deserved respect. They also wanted to look on the human form as more realistic. Before this in art, the human form was not very well depicted. But artists, especially visual artists, studied the human form and were able to create much more beautiful and detailed, realistic art based off of their studies of the form. That's realism. We see some of it in music as well. We'll talk about it more later. The other thing that was emphasized in this period was classicism. Classicism was when human beings would study the past and be inspired by it. In this particular case, people of the Renaissance were inspired by the Roman and Greek societies. They particularly thought that the architecture and art and the music of the time was inspiring and should be revived. A couple of the visual artists that are the most important from this period are Nicola Pisano, Masaccio, and Michelangelo. Many of you are familiar with Michelangelo, but perhaps you don't remember exactly what he did looks like. So let's take a look at a couple of these pieces of art, just so we better understand what the Baroque period comes from. This is Pisano's Annunciation and Adoration of the Virgin Mary. If you can look and see that there's actual depth to this sculpture, that was something very new to how art was being created. They had studied the human form enough that they wanted to put in detail, and they used light, shadow, and depth to do these things. Look at the hair on each of the figures. It's curled, and you can tell that it has individual strands. Also the clothing. You can see the wrinkles in the fabric. The facial features are still quite blurred and a little bit not detailed enough, but at least you can see the facial features and they look like they are humans. In much of the art before this, the faces were very flat and gave no expression whatsoever, and sometimes were not really recognizable because dimension was not something that was considered important to art. Now you can see that dimension has become very important to art. Perhaps Michelangelo's most famous statue, this is the statue of David. It's a story from the Bible. David was a man who slew a giant named Goliath. Now, if you look at this, you're going to see a beautiful idea of what a realistic, perfected human form looks like. Take a look at the muscles and how he's done even the hair. I think that the hair on this sculpture is actually quite amazing, as are the fingers. If you can look at a larger copy of this by finding it online, you can see how detailed the tendons in the hands are and how there are even small wrinkles on those hands. It's a perfected human form, and it's something that they really believed in studying further during this period. That's realism. On the other hand, they also believed in the more classical and the classicism traditions. Masaccio only painted religious art because he knew that the church was important and still very powerful. He also was a very early example of Renaissance art. You can see that there's less dimension, less use of light in this particular painting, but it still has some shadow and light used in it. Look at Mary's face. In this particular instance, you can see where the light is falling on her face. You can see that she's put the baby Jesus in a gold wrapping that reflects the light. So he is using these new ideas of the Renaissance art period, but he's also still a part of the past. A new generation of artists emerged in the Baroque era starting around 1600. These artists were interested and inspired in what was done during the Renaissance, but they wanted more. Society was demanding more from them. Society and the artists themselves wanted to be able to show movement, create a story, and portray human emotion in their art. They wanted to also show not just the realistic, perfected form of humanity, they wanted to show the more grotesque side of humanity as well. Take, for example, Bernini's David. This is the exact same person you just saw Michelangelo sculpt. But in this case, look at how different it is. He's actually filling space with action. It's full of movement and life, and he's telling a story. He's in the process of slinging the slingshot that's going to kill the giant. And even how he's gripping the rocks with his toe and the facial features, they're so determined. You see a real human being here, not just a perfected form. Rembrandt is also a famous painter from the Baroque period, and here you can see that he wants to do lots of self-portraits of himself. There are many self-portraits. These are some of my favorites because they really show how he plays with light and shadow to show his true form and to show what emotions he's feeling. Some of you will look at these and say that he has the same face in all three images, but I think he's chosen very specific faces. Look at the wrinkles. Look at the scowls, and look at how the pupils in the different pictures have different amounts of focus to what's going on. In the middle picture, he's in his night robe and in his night hat. He looks tired. In the other pictures, he looks pensive, thoughtful, perhaps even persuasive. He's showing emotion in how he's painting himself. Then, of course, there's Sir Peter Paul Rubens, who gives us a great example of the grotesque aspect of the Baroque. The word Baroque literally means flamboyant, grotesque, unreal. It's a word used to describe this period because there's an element of the grotesque, there's an element of extra details that have been added in based off of the simple music and art from before. So here we see the really true human form in its most debauched sense. This is a picture of the god Bacchus, drinking wine, getting drunk, all sorts of terrible things happening in this picture. Hopefully no one finds this offensive. I don't find it offensive because I feel like it's a really true portrayal of humanity when we are at our worst. And this is something that's emphasized throughout the Baroque period, not only in visual art, but in music in many ways. So why did art change this way? Well, the society that was around during the Renaissance period was very open to new ideas and experiencing new intellectual views on humanity. But as the Baroque period began, society and its structure really influenced and controlled artists and musicians because the aristocracy, the rich people, and the church had gained all of the power there was to be had, and common man was very poor. They were starving for the most part, and they simply did not hold real jobs. Most of them were serfs or slaves underneath the more powerful people that ran the churches and the aristocracy. You can see here in the two pictures an example of a church and a palace. Can you imagine living and going to worship in such settings? But this is what the common man wanted for his lifestyle and could never achieve because he was a slave to the people who did live in these types of buildings. Renaissance art changed to reflect the fact that the aristocracy and the church lived and worshipped in places such as these and had control over all of the artists and musicians creating the art. They wanted more. They wanted new, they wanted exciting, and they wanted to show off the grotesque and the overdone. And that's why they lived in places that looked like this, and it's why they created the art and music that they did. Let's talk a little bit more about the aristocracy and the church, because these are the two powerful bodies during this era in time, and they really do control so much of what happens musically. Europe was divided into many kingdoms ruled over by kings and princes. Italy itself had more than 30 kingdoms in it. This was nothing like the Europe we know nowadays. And these kings and princes that ruled their kingdoms really had so much power over the common man that they did not have to work for a living. They were very rich and very bored. And because they were bored, they needed to be entertained. So they would hire artists and musicians to create new works of art and new pieces of music for them every day. The more money one of these princes or kings had, the larger the group of musicians and artists he had available to him. They wanted new music and art too. That's very important to remember. The Renaissance was considered out of fashion already. These people were so bored, they wanted new things to listen to and new things to see that represented what they believed in and how they wanted to live their lives. It was, if you weren't rich enough to have a composer at your court, you weren't rich. The richest courts employed up to 80 musicians at a time. And it wasn't that great a life for the musicians. Remember, they were more the common man, the poor worker. Court musicians were given a paycheck, yes, but they were also given a place to live and food. So they were actually well off enough to live a good life. But in return, they were basically a slave to the court. They had to be at the beck and call of the royalty. They never had a day off. They did not get vacation. They didn't even get a sick day. However, this position was something that was stable. Financially, it was secure. You always had a place to be, and you always had food to eat, which was very important in this period when so many people were starving. So many people that had music training coveted the position of the music director, which was the head of the court musicians. Music directors were in charge of composing new music every day. They were in charge of notating that music and writing out copies for the performers. They were in charge of leading rehearsals, conducting the performers. They even had to perform themselves. They were in charge of running a music library and keeping copies of old music so that they could bring it back out and have different instruments play it. And they had to take care of all of the instruments that were owned by the court as well. It was a very, very busy life, and they didn't really get a lot of recognition except by other musicians and other court aristocracy, which didn't really matter for much because it did not help them survive their lifestyle, and they had to work hard. They had to work very, very hard. And the church was no better. Europe had split before the Renaissance into the Catholic and Protestant churches, and they were struggling to survive in this period, but the church still had the majority of money and power, even over the aristocracy. So they wanted to be able to keep people coming to church, they wanted to keep their power, and they wanted to get, like, for say, if you were Catholic, you wanted to make sure that the people who were flocking to the Protestant church returned to the Catholic church. If they were Protestants, you wanted to pull people away from the Catholic church. That warring between the two churches in Europe really attracted the churches to the idea of hiring musicians and artists to create new art, new music that was very theatrical, very grand and amazing, way overdone. By using music in the churches that was like this, they hoped to pull in a larger audience and keep people coming, both the common man and the rich aristocracy. So like I said, the churches hired musicians to compose and perform grand new music. So the music of the Renaissance was simply no more in the church. They didn't even acknowledge it as being important. They wanted people right then and there to be creating new music for them every week. Imagine going to church to worship, and every single week you went, you heard something completely new. How very different from how we live today. The churches were also really important because there really were no such things as public concerts. The churches were the only place that the common man, the poor people, could hear music, so they actually flocked to go to these 3 to 4 hour church services to listen to this beautiful music because they had nowhere else to go to hear it. But keep in mind again this idea that the average church musician, very much like the music director at a court, they were paid very little. In this case, they did not even receive a place to live or food, so they had to live on the little salary that they got from the church. But very similar to the court, they had no freedom. They were required to perform, to conduct, to lead rehearsals, to write new music every week. And this particular style of music they had to write was hard to write. It was big music, it was grand, and it was for instrumentalists and for vocalists. The life of the average musician and the life of the average music director, in courts and in churches, was a very hard life. So, why become a musician at all? There were really only 3 reasons. It was not because of a love of music. It was not because someone simply couldn't fathom doing anything else with their lives. Most professional musicians nowadays are given the chance to realize that they love music, that they're talented at it, and that they simply want to be a musician, and then they go after that career. In the Baroque period, it was simply family tradition, poorness, or a lack of parents that made you a musician. In the case of family tradition, if a father was a court organist, then the son almost always became a court organist and followed in the father's footsteps. It built great generations of musicians, and there were always some phenomenal composers being brought into the traditions that just from generation to generation in these families. But they were basically sold into a career because of their family tradition. The poorness of society also created a necessity sometimes for parents to actually sell their children into professions. They would indenture their children, so that basically what would happen is that they would offer a child to a professional musician or to a court. That court would give the child a place to live and feed them, but they would be required to do household chores as well as learn how to play an instrument and write music. When those children grew up, they then were added onto the court payroll and they had a job as a musician. It was actually a pretty great way for families who had lots of children to make a little bit more money and to make sure that their children's future was secure. One of the best places to train musicians was actually orphanages around Europe. These places were actually what became the first music schools. Orphanages all across Europe trained children as musicians and composers in order to teach them courtly skills and life skills that would allow them to get a job. So much of the court musicians during the Baroque period were made from children from orphanages that had no parents. So most people, like I said, in this period did not just simply have a love of music and then choose that career. The career was chosen for them, and that's why we have the music that we have. They saw the popular styles. It was demanded they write and perform in those musical styles, and so that is how Baroque musicians and the Baroque style were invented.